Yeah. Okay, so good afternoon now to nearly everyone. Visual everyone will be better. Okay, perfect. So we are going to start this fourth session of this international workshop, with this also cross-national but also cross-disciplinary or multidisciplinary conversations. And it's also what we are going to find in this session, because we are going to have scholars from with a law background, with social logical background, and with psychology background. So, and I think it's very interesting that we could be joining here and speaking like a kind of same language and trying to interact one with the other. So we are going to start with the presentation of Francesca Cancellaro of the University of Tuscia in Italy. Francesca has a PhD in law from the University of Bologna, and she was a postdoctoral researcher at this University of Tuscia, and at the University of Roma Tre. And Francesca is currently lawyer. She works for a law firm, and she's a legal expert for the Italian Ombudsman. And she's going to talk about immigration detention and the Italian closed ports policy. So Francesca, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you.
That's it.
I'm trying to share. Okay. Can you see them? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we see it perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be part of this event, but I also hope that there will be the possibility in the future to meet you, all of you, in person. My presentation is dedicated to the highly controversial closed ports policy, which was performed at the South Maritime border of Italy. Such a kind of policy offered me the possibility to analyze some particular aspects of the new trend of de facto deprivation of liberty at the border of Europe in the view of the protection of fundamental rights and the rule of law. Let's start by saying that the recent populist wave has impacted on the management of borders at the different levels, political, legal, and cultural ones, and has led to further compressions of migrants' fundamental rights, including personal liberty. In popular discourses, the maritime border is permanently exposed to a risk of invasion by irregular migrants and allegedly false asylum seekers, a risk on which the populist narrative often builds the support to implement restrictive immigration policies. To this regard, it has to be considered that, on the one hand, the Italian southern border is an external border of European Union, with respect to which the issue of solidarity between member states is crucial to the definition of long-term migration policies, as well as in the management of periodic emergencies. On the other hand, in the central Mediterranean route, fundamental rights are exposed to the most serious threats, represented by both natural factors and the risk of refoulement to Libya or to other countries that cannot be considered places of safety either. Uh, in, uh, in the context, in this context, the closed ports policy was developed. In the period between June 2018 and August 2019, the Italian government engaged in a real battle, a struggle against NGOs involved in rescue activities, accused of directing migratory flows toward Italy and being a kind of pull factor for new arrivals, and against other European states and European institutions blamed for leaving Italy alone in disembarking and receiving migrants and asylum seekers. Here you can find some examples of the populist discourse performed by our former Minister of Interior. As you can see, migrants are invited to go to other countries, in this case Spain. This picture says also Italians want closed ports, naval block, school open and ports closed, and so on. As you can see, this is a little idea of the nationalist propaganda that we faced in that period. Well, let's have a close, well, according to this political view, vessels that have rescued migrants at sea as part of search and rescue operations were not granted the nearest place of safety as required by international law conventions, and were served with administrative bans on disembarkation. This particular practice resulted in depriving migrants on board of their personal liberty for many days in the absence of any legal basis and judicial review. Well, now let's have a closer look to these practices in that you can find here in these yellow boxes. Two situations occurred. First, castaways were forced to remain on board on Italian military vessels after a SAR activity. In this case, the deprivation of liberty took place under the direct control of the authorities, of Italian authorities. In the second situation, migrants who had been rescued in international waters by NGOs were forced to remain on board the NGOs vessels once they reach Italy asking for a place of safety, as a consequence of the concurrent disembarking ban and the impossibility of reaching other places of safety. In these situations, the shipmaster cannot leave people free to disembark, of course, and cannot leave the port or the Italian territorial waters. In fact, according to international laws, namely the SAR Convention and the IMO guidelines, shipmasters and states have the duty to let people disembark as soon as possible in order to prevent any risk for life and personal integrity. This means that under the international law, the status of castaways prevails over the status of undocumented migrants. The mentioned cases, the mentioned situations share some common features. First, this de facto deprivation of liberty on board lasted for several days. In fact, during the standoff at sea, only the most seriously ill migrants were disembarked. Second, the uncertain length of stay on board dependent on national and European political negotiations. And please consider that also minors were well treated in this way only after days on board and upon the intervention of the competent Italian youth courts, of the national ombudsman, and the intervention of the civil society, they were allowed to disembark. Third, the absence of an individual detention order or any other individual measures. Fourth, the lack of specific remedy to challenge the lawfulness of such a kind of de facto detention. Fifth, this prolonged physical and psychological suffering on board, which is common in all these situations. Finally, there are also more consequences that have a broader relevance also with regard to possible future cases. For example, the interference with the rescue activities. In fact, NGOs, crews cannot depart to undertake other rescue activities while they are blocked at the Italian ports, for example. But please consider also the media impact, both at national and the European level, and the political exploitation of these episodes, let's say, of these people for the narrative of the invasion that I have already mentioned. Another very interesting aspect, in my view, is the way in which the closed ports policy has been implemented. In fact, in the first phase, this policy was experimented as practice, a real practice, through measures issued by Minister of the Interior, both general in scope and with directives addressed to specific NGOs. While in the second phase of this closed port policy, the very same policy was translated into law, and this law was the so-called Security Decree bis. This law contains very strict measures on illegal immigration and public security, and represents, in my view, the most extreme frontier in the process of criminalization of NGOs' sea rescue activities. Actually, even this law doesn't provide a legal basis for detention, but this is another issue, let's say. Well, as a result, between June 2018 and August 2019, rescue vessels were kept off the Italian coast for very variable periods, from a few days up to more than 20 days, even 30 days actually, before reaching a solution that would allow the docking in port and the disembarkation of the migrants rescued. As you can see, as you can read in this slide, in that period, beyond the political rhetoric, in the vast majority of cases, the disembarkations of migrants occurred as a result of arrivals with small private boats, which Italy could not stop could not stop by closing the ports and keeping them off the coast, of course. And in these cases, disembarkation has always been permitted and without negotiation with other European states. Okay, what I'd like to point out is that not only this policy was ineffective in preventing new arrivals, new disembarkation, but it also caused a series of negative side effects. First, the violation of fundamental rights of migrants and asylum seekers. In fact, the stay on board for several days on overcrowded ships, unsuitable to accommodate people in severe psychological and physical conditions, due both to the exhausting sea crossing and the brutality suffered in Libya, affects many fundamental rights, such as the right to personal liberty, as I said, the right not to be subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment, and the right to seek asylum. Second effect was the criminalization of SAR activities. In February 2020, for the very first time, the Italian Supreme Court of Legitimacy was directly involved in the issue of the criminalization of rescue activities at sea carried out by NGOs. In that occasion, well, I'm talking about the well-known Rackete case. It was about the first entry into the port of Lampedusa after the ban of Italian authorities, conducted by the shipmaster of the vessel Sea Watch 3. The master was Carlo Lacchete, and the operation was carried out in June 2019. In that occasion, the Supreme Court recognized that all rescue operations at sea up to the landing in a safe port, the so-called place of safety, and these operations are not punishable because they are covered by the legal justification of fulfilling a duty to rescue in particular, that comes from the International Convention on the Law of the Sea. The court, in the very same occasion, also ruled that only disembarking on the land concludes the rescue, and therefore a vessel cannot be considered a place where fundamental rights are guaranteed. Third effect, the policy of closed ports has come to the attention of the Italian judiciary. With regard to some cases, as you can see, Diciotti, Gregoretti, and Open Arms cases, the Minister of the Interior pro tempore, Mr. Salvini, has been charged with the crime of kidnapping for such a kind of violation of personal liberty. However, since the alleged offense has been committed by a minister in the exercise of his duties, the accused is covered by immunity unless the Senate grants authorization to proceed against the minister. While in the Diciotti case, the authorization was refused on the grounds that the minister had pursued the so-called public interest, in the Gregoretti and Open Arms cases, the same chamber of the parliament, of the Italian parliament, granted this authorization. And Mr. Salvini is now under trial for the Open Arms case. Well, what about the current situation in Italy? Well, since the government has changed twice, Italian ports are formally open again, even if European institutions haven't took any responsibility towards people in danger at sea. NGOs' activities are still prevented by many criminal investigations and administrative measures with regard to NGOs, members, and NGO themselves. And of course, also the issue of bad narratives is a problem, and the climate of suspicion still exists. Oh, sorry. Finally, I would like to say that the global pandemic has been used as an excuse to implement new unofficial forms of migrant detention on the border rescue ships, which are likely to be normalized in the future. And so, to conclude, all this means to me that we did not get rid of the closed port policy, even if the government has changed, the law has changed, and the judiciary is dealing with the criminal responsibility of our former Minister of Interior. In fact, it has been 5 years since the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights has ruled against Italy for the unlawful deprivation of liberty of migrants and asylum seekers at the Italian border. I'm talking about the Claifia versus Italy case, and the procedure before the Committee of Ministers is still going on. So the execution is still going on, the execution of this ruling. But I'd like to conclude by saying that the normalization of unlawful practice of de facto detention at the border is a real and actual problem that we are still facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So we are going to continue with the presentation of Osgoon Topak. Özgün is an assistant professor at the Department of Social Science and resident scholar at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. And Dr. Topak is an interdisciplinary social scientist whose research areas include surveillance studies, migration and border studies, and critical social theory. Özgün is going to talk about hotspots as a biopolitical border zone, the violence of containment. So the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the organizers for this opportunity, in particular, Anna. So as we all know, this workshop was planned originally for last May, and when I submitted the abstract, my paper was under review, and eventually it got published. So I'm here linking the paper which was published recently in Antipode. Okay. So let me start with some introductory remarks. So the title of the paper is Biopolitical Violence and Waiting, Hotspot as a Biopolitical Border Zone. So I changed the title a little bit to emphasize more on the category of waiting. I'm going to talk more about that. So this presentation focuses on European Union's hotspot migration management model as it was implemented in the Moria camp and in the Lesbos island of Greece. Theoretically, I drove on literatures on biopolitical border and waiting, and conceptualized the Lesbos hotspot as a biopolitical border zone where migrants experience concentrated violent practices of borders, including legal exclusion, presence of exclusionary surveillance and absence of surveillance for safety, degrading living conditions, and waiting. I particularly highlight the significance of waiting for biopolitical borders, which is the main contribution of my paper, in addition to conceptualization of the Lesbos hotspot as a biopolitical space. The paper demonstrates that waiting is entangled in a complex way with other biopolitical practices, and it both creates and amplifies biopolitical effects for migrants. So let me talk a little bit about the methodology. I conducted fieldwork in the Moria camp and the Lesbos hotspot in June 2019. The fieldwork included 12 interviews with refugees, one interview with a representative from the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, 4 interviews with the Frontex officers, and 1 interview with the Moria camp administrator. And in addition, I also drove on secondary material, such as reports of Oxfam and refugee support agent. So what is the hotspot model? Hotspot model was developed in response to 2015 migration movements. The aim was to increase the migration management capacity in first countries of arrivals to Europe, in particular Italy and Greece. The underlying rationale was both to reduce the number of arrivals and to prevent migrants from moving from Greece and Italy to other European countries. The 2016 Refugee Pact between the EU and Turkey played a key role in the implementation of the hotspot model in Greece because it allowed refugees to be sent back to Turkey from Greece. Even though few refugees, as I will explain further, ended up being sent, this pact still provided legitimation to Greece to detain refugees indefinitely in inhumane conditions, especially because of the accompanying geographical restriction policy. So geographical restriction means that refugees have to stay in the hotspots while their refugee application is processed. Special categories are normally exempt from this restriction policy, such as pregnant women and people with serious mental illnesses. And they should normally be sent to mainland Greece to wait there. But in practice, I observed that even these categories, in fact, stay in Moria camp for long periods because the mainland camps are full. As a result, most refugees, in fact, stuck in the Lesbos hotspot. And here I'm using Lesbos hotspot and Moria camp almost interchangeably, but I use the hotspot as a broader category that includes the Moria camp. Because of the geographical restriction policy, in fact, the entire island became a space of confinement for refugees. They can leave the Moria camp and they can come back, but they cannot leave the island. Okay, so let me discuss the literatures. I draw one and make a contribution to. So the first literature is the literature on biopolitical borders. So this literature came out of the critical border studies. And these critical border studies literature long emphasized that borders cannot be reduced to lines dividing states, and that they extend both inside and outside state territories through practices such as biometrics, visa policies, urban surveillance, and so on. So the biopolitical border framework can be seen as a subcategory of the critical border studies, and this emphasis on moving borders, if you like. Influenced primarily by the writings of Foucault and Agamben, this literature emphasized the need to focus on biopolitical border practices, such as surveillance, which operate both at and beyond the border, territorial borders. So this emphasis on moving borders, if you like, should not mean that spatiality of borders are losing their significance. On the contrary, in fact, many researchers have demonstrated that these biopolitical border practices are concentrated in some spaces more so than others, such as around the border crossing zones or border zones, or in detention centers, and even entire islands around these zones. And here I find Alison Moon's works on islands particularly useful. According to Moons, islands operate as an enforcement archipelago, in that they are concentrated spaces of detention and imprisonment of migrants at the margins of nation states. Islands are close to spaces of interception, and they often host military bases which can be converted to detention and processing centers for refugees. So building on the biopolitical borders literature and Alison Mons's these reflections on islands, we can conceptualize Lesbos hotspot as a biopolitical border zone. Lesbos hotspot includes refugee camps, detention centers, as well as identification, registration, fingerprinting, and asylum processing facilities, which are built in a former military base named Moria. In the Lesbos Island, migrants experience concentrated biopolitical practices, including legal exclusion and waiting, and they experience these effects of biopolitical effects in a concentrated way, and these effects include physical illnesses, injuries, as well as psychological disorders. So let me talk about the second literature, which I'm drawing on and making a contribution to, and this is the literature on waiting. Waiting implies submission, writes Bourdieu, because those who are made to wait become subordinate to the time of the powerful groups or an entire bureaucracy, as in Kafka's Trial. And they experience the power effects of waiting in the forms of uncertainty, anxiety, helplessness, and stuckness. This is particularly the case for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who experience waiting as a power technique designed to reduce them into subordinate subjectivity categories. So in my paper, I undertake a critical reading of Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and argue that waiting functions as a, quote, method of temporal regulation, aimed at creating docile, submissive, and depressed bodies and souls. I also point out that waiting interacts with other biopolitical practices, such as legal exclusion, and amplifies their effects. So this perspective is also influenced by Foucault's emphasis on interaction among micro practices of power rather than treating them as isolated categories. So let me now explain how these biopolitical practices operate and how they are amplified by waiting. So the first biopolitical practice I examine is legal exclusion. And here I'm drawing mostly on Agamben's notion of inclusive exclusion, which emphasizes that individuals are included only through suspension of their human rights. Indeed, in the hotspot, refugees are included with reduced to no human rights. The main areas of human rights violations include the asylum application process, living conditions, and lack of personal safety. I'll talk about lack of personal safety and living conditions in the following slides, but let me talk about the asylum application process now. So the process is much below international standards because of the EU-Turkey Refugee Pact. Refugees first need to prove that Turkey is not a safe country for them. If they wish to be resettled from the island, they also need to prove that they belong to a vulnerable group of category. In this context, during the interviews, refugees encounter additional problems with the EASO interview process. EASO conducts vulnerability interviews to determine whether refugees belong to a vulnerable group. However, according to the reports of the refugee organization, 70% of refugees who should be categorized as vulnerable are not categorized as such. These include victims of torture or sexual violence and people suffering from PTSD or other serious mental disorders. Refugees do not receive any legal assistance during the application or appeals. In addition to these legal problems, refugees are also confronted again by waiting, which amplifies the effects of legal exclusion. So we see that refugees wait, their waiting time changes, but on average, they wait around 1 year. All my interlocutors during the interviews, they expressed that they were waiting more than 1 year and they were still in the asylum process. They didn't know when the waiting will end, which then adds another layer of uncertainty and anxiety. This is especially the case for those who are in the appeal process. For instance, one of the interlocutors expressed that he was rejected 3 times and he was still in the appeal process. And in total, he was waiting for more than 3 years and did not have any idea about when his waiting will end. The field of surveillance and security is the second broad area I examine as a biopolitical practice and biopolitical violence against refugees. In the Lesbos hotspot, there is the presence of exclusionary surveillance, which categorizes and sorts refugees, but there is no surveillance for the purpose of ensuring safety for refugees. Exclusionary surveillance includes surveillance conducted by the Frontex and Greek authorities to identify and record refugees and sort out who should be sent back to Turkey. In this process, Frontex authorities use various surveillance technologies and techniques. For instance, they use a device called Regula to determine the authenticity of documents. They also use databases, including Eurodac, Visa Information System, and Europol databases. For suspected individuals, they additionally conduct social media and smartphone surveillance. Refugees also experience police violence and surveillance, especially in response to protests. Abusive policing also exists in urban contexts, especially for young single males. Even though refugees have the legal right to mobility inside the island, the police targets these refugees in the Mytilene city center, detains them in a police station and tells them to go back to the Moria camp. Some refugees also noted that they experienced violence by Greek citizens and vigilante group, in particular groups associated with the neo-Nazi group Golden Dawn. So what is striking here is the complete absence of surveillance when it comes to ensuring the safety and providing protection for refugees inside the Moria camp. According to a survey, 66% of refugees never feel safe, while only 8% feel quite safe or perfectly safe. Furthermore, 47% of surveyed migrants reported experiencing violence perpetrated by other refugees. Consistent with these survey results, in my interviews, refugees described the Moria camp as a space resembling the Hobbesian state of nature, where the struggle for survival among refugees leads to fights, thefts, and other forms of violence. Migrants also emphasized that fights and other forms of violence are not considered worthy of surveillance by authorities and that perpetrators are not effectively identified or prosecuted. So as with other biopolitical practices, we see similarly waiting amplifies the effects of lack of security, because the more migrants wait in these conditions, the higher the likelihood that they will be victimized. Okay, other conditions of stay. So the biopolitical violence of the hotspot is also inflicted through other conditions, which include the inhumane living conditions, lack of proper sanitation, poor quality food, lack of access to healthcare, employment, and education, and extremely low financial allowances. The Moria camp is extremely crowded, often at double its capacity. There are limited number of toilets and washing facilities. Some residents do not even have consistent access to running water and electricity. The food is extremely poor quality. Many migrants get sick because of the camp food, and they receive only 19 euro for adults and 50 euro for children per month. A vast majority of migrants do not have access to any form of employment to earn money. They do not have access to any form of education either. So healthcare and access to healthcare is another area where there's a high restriction or which it doesn't exist. 86% of migrants experienced health problems since their arrival. And the majority of these migrants, 61%, did not have any access to any form of medical care. The mental health of migrants, many of which are already traumatized by their experience of violence in their countries of origin, in transit countries, or during their travels to Greece, worsen in the hotspot. Reported mental health conditions include PTSD, depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, suicidal thoughts, and even suicide attempts. So the experience of my interviews were in correlation with the findings of these reports. Most stated that either they themselves or their close relatives suffer from psychological disorders, which were either exacerbated or created by the biopolitical conditions and waiting together. For instance, in an interview, a married refugee man, Akram, stated that after 2-3 months living in the Moria camp, my wife began to have panic attacks. When she saw all the fighting, the food is no good, everywhere is dirty. It is worth emphasizing that the person is questioned here did not have any health problems prior to coming to Moria. Here we see how the camp conditions, such as fighting, lack of hygiene, and so on, and waiting for 2-3 months in these conditions contributed to these biopolitical outcomes. Another refugee man, Muhammad, stated that his wife committed suicide after spending 7 months in the Moria camp. He similarly explained that the living conditions combined with waiting for 7 months in Moria camp contributed to the deterioration of his wife's psychology. When explaining why she committed suicide, his wife stated, "I'm tired of here. Every night here is fighting. The food is no good. The doctor is no good. I want to kill myself." Muhammad added that the mental health of their 2 children, aged approximately 11 and 15, similarly worsened in the Lesbos hotspot due to waiting in the hotspot conditions. These children began to show depressive and aggressive behavior and blamed their father for their situation. Muhammad explained, "When I talk with them, they are struggling with me, asking why we are here in a bad situation here. Why did you bring us here? What is our crime? Why are we passing this situation? Why are we not like other people coming and going?" So in interviews, many other migrants similarly identified combination of camp conditions and waiting as the root cause of their low mood, which gives rise to feelings of hopelessness and desperation. Nassim stated, "There are lots of problems in the Moria camp. They are not following our documents. I'm a young person. I came here to have a better life, to have an ID, to work, to pay taxes and everything. But right now I'm thinking that maybe only in the next world I will reach these hopes." Fadel stated, "Maximum in a week or even in 2 days, you will spend 90 euros. You need to smoke, you know the situation, you cannot stop smoking. You will smoke more because of the situation. You are just sitting in the tent, it is very hot or very cold, and it is raining. You have nothing, you don't have work, you don't have anything to do, you just sit here." So despite these tragic biopolitical outcomes, we shouldn't see refugees as completely docile and pacified. On the contrary, against all odds, many of them exercise agency and try to add an active element to their waiting. For instance, some engage in political protests to demand better living conditions and faster processing of their asylum claims. Many others try to learn new skills, socialize, and simply envision a better future. For instance, Nassim, the person I quoted before, despite his suicidal hopelessness, he was learning Greek and English, which he hoped will be helpful both in his current condition and in the future. Fadel was in fact a professional football player who couldn't continue to practice in Lesbos hotspot because of the police surveillance targeting refugees in the urban context. But Fadel did not give up. He found a way to sneak into one of the football fields without getting noticed at night to continue his practice. He also joined the football team later, supported by an NGO, and even started coaching young refugees. So to conclude, migrants are targeted by intense biopolitical practices at the Lesbos hotspot, but they also continue to exercise agency. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, you are perfect on time. I have interrupted you, sorry, at the end of the speech. So thank you very much, Özgün, and thank you also, Francesca, for being so perfectly organized with the time and for your rich presentations, of course. And now we are going to, it's the turn of Julia Manek. Julia is a research assistant and PhD candidate in the Department of Psychology at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Main. And she's also part of the Mexican Human Rights Network Grupo Impulsor contra la Detención Migratoria y la Tortura and the Colectivo contra la Tortura y la Impunidad. And she's going to, she also has evolved her ideas as many of you, as we all sent our papers 1 year before. So Özgün has published his work and others have continued working on our ideas, and she's going to speak about mapping, migration detention, Estaciones, Migratorias, Espacios, Torturantes. So I think that she's going to speak about Mexico, right? So Julia, when you want.
All right, I hope you can see my screen. Please tell me if that's not the case.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Cristina. And yeah, thank you very much to all of you, and especially to you, Anna. I'm thrilled to have the possibility to speak here in company of such brilliant and great minds. So yeah, the thoughts and findings I'm going to share with you today emerged from 2018 until the outbreak of the pandemic and the US-Mexican border regime, when I used, as Chris rightly said, to live in Mexico. And well, as part of the collective against torture and impunity and the network against migration, detention and torture, the Grupo Impulsor, the following findings are part of our collective work. They are also part of my PhD, which is situated somewhere between clinical psychology and human geography on the space of migration detention centers and its relation to the detained subjects. So having empirically started in Mexico, I'm now trying to move that over to Europe. So let's say to my own backyard, as you said rightly yesterday, Audrey, because of like, not only following the post-colonial gesture of collecting data in the south and then earning academic credits in the north, but well, now we are stuck in Mexico, and yeah, like Carrie yesterday, my presentation also differs from the original pitch, and please be prepared. Sometimes I'll share my presentation and sometimes you will just see, well, me and my video. And yeah, today and with you, I'd like to elaborate on the concept of the torture space, building on testimonies of detainees. And at this point, I'd also like to express a content notification as I also narrate explicit forms of violence. So, yep. All right, so now torture and or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatments are understood as intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering on a powerless victim, usually a detainee, for a specific purpose, such as extraction of confession of, or information or intimidation or punishment committed by a public official. So, however, what if this infliction of suffering is not committed by a public official, but invoked by the architecture, by the infrastructure or topography of, yeah, there's no slides, yeah, merci, of the detention center itself. So although In the framework of human rights, the UN Convention Against Torture was adopted nearly 40 years ago and is still used widely today. The European Court of Human Rights chose not to define torture and refers to it as a living instrument, emphasizing that what constitutes torture is expected to differ over time. So differing in its forms, in its political, historical embeddedness, and as well as the way we are looking at it. So in line with that claim, the idea of migration detention as a torture space will challenge prevailing expectations on what torture is and checks also basic legal assumptions, because you would not need to make a step back. So torture not seen as only a direct action of a particular agent directed against a particular person in order to break this person psychologically or physically, but as the environment that literally touches everyone, the whole population of detainees. So let's move over to Mexico. And as Marta already pointed out greatly yesterday, Mexico has converted itself more and more in a vertical border, an externalized border of the US. So Mexico's simultaneous role of being a country of origin as well as a transit country, and recently also more and more receiving country of migration, that made Mexico one of the most active detaining countries in the world. So, however, this scenario is framed by the very progressive Mexican migration laws. So, since its publication in 2011, undocumented migration is decriminalized and considered merely an administrative misconduct, which is great, but the reality of the executive forces is diametrically different, and that connects us to what Cristina, Devika, and Diego depicted yesterday in the case of Spain and the Cates. Regarding detention, the migration law in Mexico simply does not mention it, or rather explains it as a form of accommodation in the euphemistically called Estaciones Migratorias, so migration stations, that de jure totally respect human rights standards. And when I started interview mapping in August 2018, that was actually the moment of the exodus that Marta commented on yesterday, with thousands of people forming a marching caravan, or more than one, but that resembled very much the March of Hope in the European Summer of Migration in 2015. So instead of being isolated individuals who tried to cross the necropolitical vertical border in a state of invisibility and vulnerability, the caravans were a means of protection, and as such also included women with children and queer people and people with disabilities that were also in the move. And you will probably remember that the first caravans simply overran the southern frontier between Guatemala and Mexico, and the reaction of the Mexican state considered very much in what Alison said yesterday, at first in establishing corridors and humanitarian camp structures, and then adopting repressive measures of massive incarceration in the Estaciones Migratorias, which have been persistently criticized by human rights actors already before 2018. So, I'm going to get back to my slides. And so that's the scenario where my research empirically emerged. So I'm going to show you parts of interview mappings that were conducted only with formerly detained migrants in shelters where the interviews should not be exposed to repression. So the interview part explored forms of subjectivation, including mechanisms of subjections and spaces of agency and resistance. So it connects very much to what you just said, Özgün. And so it was oscillating between the questions of what the institution has been doing to the migrants and vice versa. The mapping part was then derived from a psychogeographical countermapping referring to floor plan of the detention center's architecture according to the subjective memories of the interviews, where bodily and or emotional feelings and sensations could be marked in the respective colors that you can see here. And you can also see that the interviews had been detained in several Estaciones Migratorias, and for time restrictions, for sure, we will just have a closer look on one place, which is Siglo XXI in Tapachula, which is a nodal point and the biggest of all detention centers, situated very much in the southern border. So I'll show you now 3 mappings where you can see the intersections of direct violence and harm caused by the detention center in space itself as of the authorities and other detainees. So this is a map of, let's call him Alberto. He drew a very precisely structured map. We can see here, I don't know if you see the flash, well, my mouse, yeah, okay. Thanks. We can see the office area where people are already separated according to their gender inside the front part of the building. So here you can see the space where women are detained that Alberto couldn't see. So here we are in the men area. People are registered there and have to give away their belongings. And the men's cell consists of several huge cells of massive incarceration, separating detainees then according to their nationalities, each being overcrowded. The back area has a small football field that was called a recreational area. And Alberto, he described that he had been beaten in a disgusting sanitary installation in the external area. He was not beaten by the authorities of the Instituto Nacional de Migración, the INM, but by other detainees who were part of exactly the same gangs because of whom he had actually decided to flee his home country. Although the agents were not physically involved in the beating, they were either not prohibiting it or even strategically encouraging it. So having been put then in a solitary confinement cell, supposedly for his protection, he was instead exposed to the abuse of the very same persons who had beaten him before, because an open strip in the wall permitted them to throw burning cigarettes and dirty waters on him. So this is the confinement cell, and it's the place that it's like most orange. So that was my first remark when I thought, wow, the detection architecture is exposing instead of protecting. Well, for sure, but just as a remark in, yeah. So the next map is from Beto and Carlos, who had been migrating together. They had been violently arrested and then were detained first in La Ventosa, where they were not allowed to sit down for hours. And when someone could not stand any longer, he was beaten up again by INM agents. And beds consisted of blocks of concrete. It was so overcrowded that there were fights about who could sleep on top of a concrete block. And after 4 days, both were transferred to Siglo XXI, which you can see here. Now, in both installations, they experienced extreme heat and also coldness. In Tapachula, they were detained with nearly 100 co-nationals in the massive incarceration cell. The sanitary installations, which you can see here, had no water. The smells were disgusting, especially in the suffocating heat of the day, and in the toilet was no privacy. So because there was no toilet paper, Carlos, he said that he had 2 t-shirts and he ripped the second t-shirt to clean himself. They said also that another detainee had committed suicide outside. When they had been there, he climbed onto a wall that separated the outside from the inside and jumped down head first, and his body was left visible for several days, exposed on the ground, so that the detainees had to see it. Now, our last mapping is from Donovan, who was detained more or less at the same time when Carlos and Beto were there. And he, though, encountered a different environment. He was in the area of adolescence that was partially air-conditioned and felt cold. So maybe here it's important to mention what David already said. That's the detention area of unaccompanied minors, and specific monitoring was done and public pressure raised, leading to also a harmonization of the migration law regarding children and adolescents in 2020. But so nevertheless, of these better conditions, the climatization of the cell, Donovan, was not given any blankets and so suffered from the cold. And in the bathroom, there were dirty waters flowing out. So black waters would swap in and out of the canalization system, while Beto and Carlos reported a lack of water in the tap and toilets. Donovan reported that there was too much water coming out, which is pointing at a manipulation of the infrastructure. Yeah, out of the interview mappings emerged different hypotheses, which you could see in my exposition. And I'd like to focus on one, which is the hypothesis of the torture space, which says that in the Estaciones Migratorias, detainees are systematically mistreated because of the degrading treatment by the guards, but also because of the inhuman infrastructure conditions, the manipulations of infrastructure and architecture. Discrimination, threats, and punishment merge with pathogenic food and extreme temperatures. For this reason, the Estaciones Migratorias can be considered a torture space. So, yet the focus on the idea of the torture space bears some difficulties and also conflicts, because the torture space is not equal to torture, but is derived from an existing framework on torture. So it's very important to establish analytical differences in order not to blur the concept of torture or even trivialize it. Now, the Istanbul Protocol, which is the UN instrument for documenting torture, foresees a psychological, medical, and legal expert opinion. And this paper for sure stems from the perspective of the psychologist who I am, and on the geographical issues of space. So I will also touch on legal terrain, but this is rather like a tentative horizon. And if we have a look beyond Mexico, what would the torture space then consist of? Yeah, the torture space challenges expectations of torture being directed first against the physical integrity of a person. Instead, there is no doubt, as Özgün said, so emphasized really well, that there is no doubt that migration detention and or campsites have a severe impact on the detainee's mental health, independently of its geographical place. So actually there are so many studies that we really do not need anymore, I think. And especially children who had not shown any psychological symptoms before detention then used to develop new mental, also physical, but mental health difficulties within detention. Also, symptoms of torture survivors in their home countries are similar to symptoms of human beings who have lived through migration detention, feelings of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, and a high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder. So now, while place in human geography could contingently be everywhere, detention centers, however, are not, right? So mostly they are places that isolate, that obscure torture and create spaces of impunity. Their infrastructure emphasizes that. They often consist of military installations, of prison complexes, of thick concrete walls with thin or no roofs that provide no shelter against the weather or even aggravate its impacts. And a camp in Switzerland, for instance, consists of an old underground factory, which is a suffocating environment without any fresh air. A former detainee recapitulated that they were in constant fear that if ever a fire broke out, everyone just would die in there. In Mexico, the camp of Chetumal is built next to a military training camp, so detainees who often fled organized violence or military conflict had to listen to the shootings, also at night. And ironically, let's say, wow, that's the very best way of re-traumatizing people. And if space is formed by and relevant for social relations, which is a specific argument of Doran Massey, migration detention for sure prevents reciprocal relations. So dehumanizing conditions often meet neglective or abusive staff, and even among detainees, it is really difficult to uphold caring relationships. So detention and fear of deportability vulnerabilizes to such an extent that, as you already said, Özgün, that detainees self-harm, that they attempt to commit suicide. And so imagine if a person who has always been okay, so how can you stay fine and or okay when you're exposed to other detainees killing themselves out of despair? And I'd like to share some last thoughts on intentionality with you, because the Convention Against Torture defines torture has to be intentionally inflicted. And so the question is the torturous space then produced with torturous intention? And then the question remains, so how should it be possible to prove that a state's intention to punish literally any person detained in refugee campsites if this very state rejects such an assumption and hides behind either remoteness or behind human rights discourses, as post-colonial Western states are used to do? So there is no doubt that the harsh impact of detention is causing. So nevertheless, supranational and national actors invest billions in securitization politics, but not in the dignity of human life. As I said before, and different from many of you who are here, so I'm really interested also in your feedback, I'm not a legal expert. So for us, the Grupo Impulsor, the quest for a legal conceptualization of the torture space has also become a struggle for justice, but it might be a sword without a blade, not only because David says that anyway states recreate some or derail progressive practices, but also as practices of migration detention themselves has already been very resistant to even conventional forms of legal correction. Yet calling migration detention a torture space would implicate the intentionality behind the human rights violations. It would give the detention space a name of probably political value, and while that name should also be handled with sensibility and care due to the stigma that often goes along with having survived torture, it also acknowledges the detainees as subject of rights instead of disenfranchised beings and or objects of humanitarian aid. And concluding, I'd like to quote Boris Bushani, who has been, as Alison said already, detained several years on Manus Island, and he says, language is very important. Quote, sorry, language is very important because the government created some terms and concepts, and unfortunately, all other actors use the language of the government. So the government says that, oh, this space is an offshore processing center, but in fact, it's not that. Some of the refugees created another term. They called them offshore processing torture. I think the words have power. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And well, thank you to all the panel because you have been, thank you for your presentations and the enrichment of facts and of realities and also of theoretical frameworks to think about. So I don't know if there is any question or not. Someone